Hello, everyone, and welcome to this plenary lecture of our Darkness in the American Imagination conference. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, our first keynote speaker, Dr. Kyle T. Mays. Dr. Mays is an assistant professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's a transdisciplinary scholar of urban history and studies, Afro-Indigenous studies, and contemporary popular culture. He has authored several books, including Hip-Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip-Hop in Indigenous North America, published by the State University of New York Press in 2018. Also, an Afro-Indigenous History of the United States by Beacon Press in 2021, and more recently, in 2022, City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Today, Professor Mays will deliver his lecture entitled Indian Popular Culture, Musings on Cultural Appropriation and Representation. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Kyle T. Mays.
Thank you all to the organizers for organizing. I understand how much labor it is to put on a conference, especially across multiple continents, time zones. So shout out to y'all, much appreciated. And thank you for the invitation. Let's just get into it. So I'm going to do a bit of an overview, and then I will go on from there. So when I set out to write my first book, Hip-Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip-Hop in Indigenous North America, I was set on exploring two questions, really. First, how do Indigenous peoples produce a modern identity and aesthetic through hip-hop culture? In other words, how do they challenge, disrupt, and actively disregard colonial fantasies about them? Second, what is the relationship between Black and Indigenous peoples, specifically through hip-hop culture in the context of the US, mostly the US and also Canada? Since the book came out in 2018, I've had numerous responses, mostly positive, and I believe I've explored those questions that I just mentioned well enough. Students seem to love it. Lay people seem to love it. Indigenous peoples from the res to the city, by res I mean reservation or reserve as I say in Canada, seem to enjoy the writing. But from my own perspective as a writer, and for those who have written or are writing, often you can change your thoughts, your perspectives, and all those sorts of things, arguments that you do, maybe you want to do things differently. I didn't adequately enough place Indigenous hip hop within the larger conversation of what I call Indian popular culture. And for me, I argue that Indian popular culture is the gendered, racialized, and embodied expressions of Indigenous identity, modernity, and the assertion of sovereignty through expressive culture in contemporary times. Essentially, it's a way for Indigenous peoples to express themselves without having to cater to, and sometimes they still do, to settler fantasies about how they're supposed to look, exist in the world, and just be in general. And so in this talk, it's an extension or an attempt, a remix, if you will, of arguments I made in the first book, but thinking very differently. If you're a hip hop fan, I'm talking about 90s to early 2000s, you could think of it as a sort of Jay-Z doing the Blueprint 1 and the Blueprint 2. So in the overview here, let me go back. I'm going to briefly talk about historical representations of the Indian, Black and Indigenous relations, again, specifically in the context of the US, more specifically Indian popular culture, a few examples of Indigenous hip hop, and what I would call the possibilities. We may even say pitfalls, if you will, as well, of Indian popular culture. And within this, I'll also fold in discussions, brief discussions of representation. So Today, Indigenous creatives, as I like to call them, are not just responding to cultural appropriation. I know when I talk to students, give talks, it's always a major conversation, even amongst my Indigenous peers and so forth. Through Indian popular culture, they're actively creating variegated meanings of Indigenous identity and belonging beyond the settler nation state. Defining notions of Indigenous identity and cultural production, Indian creatives are setting the trend of what a diverse set of Native people can be in the world of popular culture. The representation of Indigenous peoples has and continues to be a foundational part of American popular culture, as foundational as to blackface and minstrelsy is to American culture, but is a disfigured, perverse notion of Native identity. As Indigenous studies scholar Phil Delory has argued, quote, playing Indian is a persistent tradition in American culture, stretching from the very instant of the national Big Bang into an ever-expanding present and future. It is, however, a tradition with limitations. Not surprisingly, these cling tightly to the contours of power, end quote. Deloria makes it clear that the persistence of these representations of Indigenous peoples have been foundational to the development of American identities. There are many examples from the Boston Tea Party during the colonial era of the United States, when rebellious British colonists dressed up as Mohawks to dump tea into the Boston Harbor, to the National Football League Super Bowl just this in February of 2023. And you can hear the chants, you can see the feathers, the painting of white faces red, and it is a tradition rooted in demonizing and disregarding the lived, diverse reality of Indigenous peoples. It's an attempt to keep still Indigenous peoples in a certain time and place to justify the historic and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the continued occupation of their land. Furthermore, there have been 3 points of Indigenous representation in American society: disappearance, the idea of the pure, noble Indian, and the savage violence that they so allegedly represented. This leads me to the next subject here, cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation, I think most of us have a sense of this, is the idea that a dominant group takes at will cultural markers or expressions from a powerless group and appropriate them for capital gain. And so I think the important thing here is what's often divorced in discussions or missing from discussions of cultural appropriation is the fact that it's about political economy, right? It's about how to make money off of someone else's cultures. Now, of course, if you go on TikTok or see different things, you can see Black women's hairstyles, all sorts of things being appropriated. And so there's a political economy component and how people, you can go viral using another culture's things. They seek to assign themselves as Indigenous creators of a cultural element. Because of their origin story, they seek to profit from it. In other words, the appropriation of culture is not far removed from the expropriation of land, because they both require erasure and a justification for that erasure for the purpose of profit. Nevertheless, I'm not one who spends a lot of time critiquing every little thing that non-Indigenous peoples do when they engage in an act of appropriation. It is an everyday form of racism. Is it an everyday form of racism? Absolutely. However, I consider 2 things. First, we live in a settler colonial society. As historian Ibram Kendi argues, anyone can reproduce racist ideas and practices, especially anti-Blackness. And I would add that anyone can reproduce settler colonial fantasies about Indigenous peoples. Second, what is the intent and outcome of that appropriation? Native psychologists have studied the impact of mascots and other racist depictions of Indigenous peoples and linking it to things like an increase in youth suicide. However, these things are inevitable in a colonial society. While I think mascots should be banned, I don't believe that better representation leads to more respect and return of land. So often you hear folks say, we're going to decolonize by doing X, Y, and Z. And so for me, decolonization is not better representation in a colonial society. I like to keep my notion of decolonization strict and narrow. It's about returning land. Cultural appreciation is different from appropriation. It is a respect for the people that produce that culture. It's not concerned with making profit or erasing people. For example, when people try to suggest that Indigenous hip hop is a form of cultural appropriation, I like to challenge that. In some instances, it can be. In most instances, as far as I've studied, Indigenous peoples respect Black culture and history, and many have, and this is important to say, Black friends and family, which is significant. Because in other words, this is the culture in which they're growing up. I often tell my students sometimes there are white people who grow up in predominantly Black spaces. And in a sense, they are culturally Black. And most of them truly understand that they are white, right? But culturally, they are Black. Without understanding these elements, we just can fall into the trap that it's just cultural theft or colonization. It's difficult for Indigenous peoples to produce culture under colonial domination. As decolonial theorist Frantz Fanon argues, Indigenous cultures under colonialism, quote, is a culture under interrogation whose destruction is sought systematically, end quote. Therefore, many times, Indigenous artists are spending more time than I think they should on producing expressive culture that seeks to challenge anti-Indigenous racism. Yes, that is important, but it should not stifle their creative genius and limit the possibilities of expressive culture for anti-colonial features. However, Indigenous artists use Indigenous creative critique to challenge racism. So I wanted to set that up and introduce myself a bit more formally as I move into the next particular phase. So I'm Black and Saginaw Chippewa, which is a tribe in the state of Michigan, about, if you ever heard of Detroit, about 2 hours north of Detroit, northwest, but in the center of the state. My great-grandmother came to Detroit in 1940 after leaving the reservation. Shortly after her arrival, she married my great-grandfather's African-American, and they had 9 Afro-Indigenous children. Herself became a well-respected elder in the city of Detroit. She fought for the rights of Indigenous youth to have cultural spaces and educational spaces that respected them and acknowledged their Indigenous heritage. She was active on behalf of children's welfare, forming her own nonprofit organizations and testifying before the United States Congress in regard to children in the foster care system. Her actions and that of many other Indigenous women in the 1970s led to the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, which the Supreme Court in the United States just validated. And many of us across Indian country are very worried about that conservative Supreme Court, but they upheld this particular law, which was surprising. There are many examples of Black and Indigenous relations historically, and those who are not familiar with U.S. history, I will briefly explain these, but if you have questions in the Q&A, feel free to ask them. During the era of enslavement in the United States, there was what was called the 5 tribes, so Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. And the elite, not everyone in those tribes, but the elite of those tribal nations enslaved Africans to show that they were civilized. They also were trying to ward off encroachment of white Americans on their land. It's a hell of a way to show civilization to enslaved people. You have to remember many indigenous nations had this notion of captivity that had already been a part of their way of life for centuries. They didn't do chattel slavery, and then some of them shifted into chattel slavery. There's also the example of the Buffalo Soldiers. They were the 9th and 10th Cavalries of African-American soldiers, mostly Civil War veterans, who participated in acts of genocide on behalf of the United States government. So this is really the period from 1878 up until and different wars across the world that the Buffalo Soldiers participated, but really from like the 1870s to the 1890s. They had their own reasons, but it's still worth mentioning. However, though, even in the era of the 1960s and 70s, there are a few examples of Black and Indigenous solidarity. I'm going to skip over those. Stokely Carmichael, who had changed his name to Kwame Ture, was one such person. He actively and consistently sought to challenge African Americans to think about the relationship to land in the United States. And he is probably one of the few African Americans who actually did this. So you can see here, he said, anybody who thinks seriously about working on behalf of the red man must deal with this truth. The land on which we live, on which we inhabit, which we exploit, that land belongs to the red man. He must come first in any dealings with the land. Right now, in my analysis of history, the Black Panther Party perhaps was another set of folks who were dedicated to covering Indigenous activism in the 1970s, but Stokely was the most consistent and direct in saying that this is actually Indigenous people's land. Now let's shift to contemporary popular culture. So I defined it earlier. There's a definition on the left, but I want to explain its modes. All right, so it consists of aesthetics and visual art. And by aesthetics, I also mean fashion. For example, I have this, what I would describe as native bling, the combination of powwow regalia and beading with the hip hop aesthetic, various forms of writing and literary production, how Indigenous peoples utilize social media. So them producing content on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, for the old heads here, Facebook, all those sorts of utilizations of social media. The music that they produce, and also film, television, and other forms of media beyond social media. And for me, all these forms represent the pantheon of Indigenous expressive culture. It is what Fanon calls combat literature. Which Fanon says here, this combat literature, in the true sense of the word, calls upon a whole people to join in the word. It calls upon a whole people to join in the struggle. It informs the nation, the national consciousness, gives it shapes, contours, and opens up new unlimited horizons. Right, so I consider all these forms, especially in the contemporary time after dealing with centuries of mischaracterizations, erasure, and so forth, it is a sort of renaissance moment for Indigenous creatives to challenge colonialism and to demonstrate their own creative genius while also producing critiques and trying to think beyond the settler colonial imaginary. It's also about features, Indigenous features, coined by Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon and drawn in part from Afrofuturism. It allows for Indigenous creatives to represent themselves as three-dimensional people and not just only in the present, but also in the future. So now I want to shift into a few brief examples of Indigenous hip hop as in demonstrating of Indigenous features and Indian popular culture as articulated just a few moments ago. So in defining Indigenous hip hop, it's how Native peoples challenge colonialism and racism and express ideas about themselves, society, and I would say also their futures. It's an embodied practice rooted in gendered and racialized processes of existence within a settler colonial racial capitalistic society. It is a modern indigenous expressive culture. So I want to play this particular track. Hopefully, Wi-Fi for whatever reason has been pretty shoddy. But if not, I will just skip over them. So this track is called "For Women by Women" by Cree rapper Equal, who is from Saskatchewan in Canada. And she has been doing hip hop since the 90s and continues to produce music that represents Indigenous women, critiques of society, and how they are represented. So again, I'm going to play this. Hopefully it works. And if not, then I will briefly describe the takeaway from this particular track. Let me make sure I share sound. And can someone give me a thumbs up to make sure y'all can hear it? Just the little emoji, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, we do.
Cool, cool.
Yeah. Who are we doing this for? Who are we doing this for? For women, by women, ride or die woman, stay fly and hold us up high woman. For women, by women, ride or die woman, stay fly and hold us up high woman. Do this for my girls, don't give a damn about perception. For women, by women is in session. Unapologetic and powerful and poetic. And you better believe that if I want it, sure, I can get it. Apply eyeliner slow and just so. My body, my temple decorated like a pro. My body, my temple make mistakes as I go. Flawlessly imperfect, I just love me though. Fashion over function since the 90s. Impress the boys, man, that stuff's behind me. Sneakers on point, I just can't miss. Won't catch me in heels until they're genderless. Relax my midsection and eat something healthy. Not trying to be somebody's trophy or wifey. No. Media keeps telling me be who you wanna be, and at the same time bombarding me with patriarchal imagery. Trying to tell the next gen how to not give a shit. Plotting revolution while applying lipstick. Trying to tell the next gen how to not give a shit. Plotting lipstick while applying revolution. Yeah, nails done, hair done, everything did. But sometimes I sit ratchet in the comfort of my crib. Cause I can do anything and everything big. I don't need to compensate for what you lack, that's your biz. I've said it repeatedly, man, I do this for the kids. We gotta raise them up to have this knowledge in their heads. Women are important, women are the world. Identify your pride for inner child and little girls. We living in a time that's putting pressure on these queens. Focus on appearance, not enough pursuit of dreams. Smash the patriarchy, interfering with our means. It is our own duty to reclaim and intervene. You can call me a bitch, I'm feminist, I don't care. I'm too focused on my own, with my hands in the air. Unless you are an ally, keep opinions over there. Cause I do what I want, so kiss my bannock derriere. For women, by women, 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 ride or die woman, stay fly and hold us up high woman. For women, by women, ride or die woman, stay fly and hold us up high woman. For women, by women, ride or die woman, stay fly and hold us up high woman. For women, by women, ride or die woman, stay fly and hold us up high woman. For women, by women, for women, by
So what I like about this, of the many things, is the chant for women by women, suggesting that it's a chant to challenge. So one, the chant is a call and response, right? So call and response is a African-American linguistic mode of discourse rooted in West African linguistic practices, and also in a more modern context, the African-American or the Black church, where the preacher says something and the audience says something. So it's a chant, but it's also rooted in indigenous ways of expression, as well as First Nations, in this particular case in Canada. You see the multi-generations, from those who are pregnant to young people, a very snippet piece of some elders, middle-aged women. You have the elements of traditional practices and also hip hop practices all happening at the same time, right? And it's a celebration, which in the context of missing and murdered Indigenous women, these sorts of anthems are meant to provide alternative narratives and scripts that Indigenous women are here now and will continue to be well into the future. So this next one is a little different in a lot of senses. So I'm gonna let this play. This is from Savage Fame and Alas. A few of my favorite hip hop duo and groups in person. So I'm gonna let this one rock out.
I got some natives in here's what they telling me. They'd rather be selling D or committing some felonies than be out to this praying, cause of them that be hella weak. Cause we should beat them cats who did this shit to us until they bleed. Fell asleep with the wheel. From here I'm smoking weed and pills, and everybody else I'm praying hope for people we should kill. Straight this character's a secret, cause people, they ain't really down to sing and dance of power now and then keep it up in the house. Is what you afraid of? Our natives are dying slow, so scared we hit the easiest target and fight our own. But go ahead and come after me, cause I'm after them. But first go out to look around and see what's still happening, cause I can't watch these kids die and then lie like I give a fuck and not do a fucking thing but lie down like I given up. So get a gun if you ready. We gripping on the machete. For anybody involved, we got a problem forgetting where you at. Where you motherfuckers been? We on the front line, walking with the dead. Where you motherfuckers been? We on the front line, walking with the dead. Kill them all. Kill them all. Kill them all. Kill them all. Kill them all.
We stay running, gunning, bucking for the struggle, scrapping for our dignity till we bloody up these knuckles. Our protectors got power flowing like an ancient stream. Yeah, they be ghosting violators like it's the fucking routine. Now this savage path to freedom might be seeming extreme, but I ain't losing one more soul to the booze or amphetamine. See, when I was a youngster, almost lost my fucking mind. Didn't recognize my purpose, didn't value this life. Propaganda almost had me convinced I was worthless, but if I kill myself, I'd just be doing them a service. We can never live free while this land remains stolen. Concrete muffles the earth, so it's like her breath she be holding. We can't breathe until she breathes, so you know how we be rolling. Civilization brought the illness, rebel vengeance brings the realness. Inflict damage on the cracker till the lungs are puffing shallow. We don't miss a single target when we aiming from the shadows.
Where you motherfuckers been? We on the front line, walking with the dead. Where you motherfuckers been? We on the front line, walking with the dead. Kill them all. Kill them all. Kill them all. Kill Kill 'em all. Kill 'em all.
So this particular song, the one of many verses in the song that I like is "Alas," the young woman in the second part, and she says, "We can never live free while this land remains stolen." Right. So it's a direct mention of the settler colonial situation in which indigenous peoples are living. She mentions all the social or many social ills that indigenous peoples have to deal with: alcoholism, drug addiction, as a result of colonization, right? And I remember Vice called me, one of the media outlets, about this song years ago, and they seemed to be stunned that they were having children with guns in the particular video. Now, in the States, of course, and this is not an exaggeration, there's gun violence all the time, right? Mass shootings, and I'm sure many of you see it in the media often, but it's difficult to tell colonized peoples how they are in fact supposed to respond to the violence of colonialism. It's phenomenal to say the onset of colonization was violent, and paraphrasing here, also what he would call atmospheric violence. How are people supposed to respond to colonialism? So producing what, again, he called combat literature is one approach to the colonial situation. And so the last one, to me, by Superman, a Crow artist who has done a lot of creative things, is about Indigenous features, combining the past and the future. So I'm going to play this video, make some last comments, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Hello. Shoda. Kahe. Inababa izagusa. Disjusilla.
Disaba. Shokalalo.
Balaja weage machla. Superman hook.
Superman.
Baba. Alagosa. Koguka bau. Biak de shik. Biak balachik.
Kotuk balakhe.
Inababa balai balay bilakbag. Hana awa bazaka chikatala. Dagolak. Dagwa. The shiptala. Diluk dilak. O chiptala.
sent to do. Don't be blinded, get closer to God in a tight situation. This hip-hop, and we's a nation. All my people, come on, come on, come on. All the ladies, come on, come on, come on. Everybody, come on, sing. Everything's gonna be alright. Like Bob Marley say, wake up and we start to praise. How we start the day, we fall from faith to jars of clay. Everybody come and walk this way, and yo, we'll let him hear. Let go of all your stress and fear. And yo, I'm trying to have the best this year. Your blessings near, yeah. So let's be clear. Life is short, it ain't lasting long. So I'm rapping strong until the passion's gone. And leave a legacy and pass batons. And when I'm passing on, remember me, yo, but blast this song. Come on.
Every day we get up and fight. We choose to be the light. Everything gonna be alright.
Can't rest until I accomplish what I was sent to do. Don't be blind, get closer to God in a tight situation. And we's a nation.
Everything gonna be alright. Alright. Everything gonna be alright. Alright. Everything gonna be alright. 'Cause if I fall 7 times, I know I'ma get up 8. I know I'ma get up 8. I won't be afraid. No, I'ma keep going.
Can't rest until I accomplish what I was sent to do. Don't be blinded, get closer to God in a tight situation. This hip-hop, and we's a nation. Welcome to Mother Earth, where hurt people, and the birds are still chirping on the church steeple. Reverse the curse, set me first lethal. I ride rhymes, let my light shine, watch me murky. But y'all keep holding on. I know you're strong because life is really what you focus on. So skip the hatred, it's dangerous. How to get each other, we're manipulated. Cambridge Analytica. I don't know who needs to hear this, but don't be mad at me. You wanna change the world? Go home and love your family.
Don't worry.
Go home and love your family.
Don't worry. Everything's gonna be alright. About a thing. 'Cause every little thing is gonna be alright. About a thing. 'Cause every little thing is gonna be alright. 'Cause if I fall 7 times, I know I'ma get up 8. I know I'ma get up 8. I won't be afraid. No.
So there's so much that I think that are very cool about that particular video. So the reference to Back to the Future, if you have seen that or haven't seen it in a while, going back in time to what appears to be the 19th century up until the origins of hip hop in 1980, not literally the origins, but a particular moment in 1985. And then up till 2021, and then circling, going all the way back prior to sort of the colonization of the Americas and the arrival of Christopher Columbus. So it's blending both space and time, technology, but acknowledging with the anthem that everything's going to be all right. So it's going back in time and also projecting a particular future that Indigenous peoples will exist well into the present. And it reminds me, as Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson argues, we cannot survive as a people without creating generations of artists, thinkers, makers, and doers to live in indigenous worlds that are in a respectful relationship with each other, that create a movement that joins us to other indigenous nations to protect the lands and bodies. And I think Indian popular culture is helping us move forward in that particular way. So some last few marks and I'll stop here. Any popular culture offers us many possibilities. However, we shouldn't rely on it in total. We're at a point of contention within Indigenous popular culture and representation. It seems we're in a positive stage in Indian cultural production for mainstream audiences. We have three seasons now of highly successful shows, including Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls. And there are several other shows with Indigenous characters and themes focused on, for example, Indigenous issues, including missing and murdered Indigenous women. Yet there remains a limitation on cultural appropriation discourse. During the first season of Reservation Dogs, if you haven't seen it, do check it out if you're able. I received numerous messages from a variety of Indigenous peoples asking my opinion on the appropriation of Black culture in the show. I wanted to wait and see the entire season before I rushed to judgment. A major critique levied by some was hip hop's representation, including the performance of Muskogee Creek rapper Stan Jody's Greasy Fried Bread. After watching the entire show in music, I didn't see the level of appropriation that everyone else claimed. Thus, there seems to be two things in tension: an uncritical discussion of cultural appropriation and the desire for more representation. How do we come to exploring these tensions? I think in this context in which discussions of cultural appropriation exist, in other words, we're in a moment of crisis and the facade of possibilities. Indian popular culture is meaningful, but as my friend and comrade Bryce Henson, a professor at Texas A&M University, often reminds me, representation is meaningful, but what does it mean? In other words, more representation is not going to ultimately return land and better relations between human and non-human species. We have much work to do, but I believe in us. I believe colonial domination will end, and I think Indian popular culture can play a significant role. Miigwech, thank you. Looking forward to Q&A.
Thank you so very much for such an enlightening presentation. It's been truly very inspiring. It is now time for questions. So if you would like to ask a question to our keynote speaker, please use the raise hand tool here in Zoom, or as you know, the chat box, and we can read them out loud. Do we have any questions? Yes, so Unlimited Knowledge has a question.
Sorry, that's not my real name, it's my work Zoom. So first of all, I thought that was one of the best papers I've heard at a conference. But I was really interested in so the Native American hip hop we were listening to, how well known is it in America? I mean, if you think about, because some of those artists had really commendably challenging lyrics, especially Savage Fam. Have they, if it is well known amongst the non-Indigenous population, is that right? Has it evoked any controversy? Because with some of the lyrics being challenging, has anyone, I don't know, complained about it or said it's too confrontational or something? Or what has been the reaction?
Well, I would say in general, no. Most Indigenous artists are not mainstream in a sense of trying to think of a contemporary rapper. I'm stuck in like 2014, 2015 still. But if you were to say a Black artist, no, not mainstream in that sense. I will say a particular video about the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was, you know, an international issue that was pretty well known. The particular video won a VMA or Video Music Award for inspirational about social change and so forth. And there were all sorts of Native artists within that particular video. And I'm blanking on his name right now for whatever reason, but he was an artist from the Snake Eyed Peas. So that was kind of the most mainstream. In Canada, it's a little different. So you have groups, they've changed their name since to Hallucination, but they were called A Tribe Called Red. And they are, you know, relatively mainstream in Canada, for example. But as far as Savage Fam, they were important enough for Vice, the news outlet, to contact me about the lyrics, the video, and the content. They continue to produce sort of music, but I would say it is as fringe as you might say as a group like Dead Prez was in the late 90s, 2000s. So people know of them, but there are restrictions when you do that sort of music. But I've written about them even as something like The Source. And one of them sent me a message like, thanks for mentioning, because no one ever mentioned us. I'm like, y'all do dope work though.
Cool. That's the other thing I was going to ask, actually. Can you, maybe this isn't the best time for it, but could you remind me the names of some of your books? I'll just look them up.
I didn't get the last part.
I said I'll just look them up.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? If we don't, I do have a question. I find very interesting how this music, especially All Right, the last one that you played, Will, showed us, insists on expressing joy for and of Indigenous communities. And I was wondering if you could perhaps comment further on the significance of not simply centering on pain, but of signaling that discrimination and violence through celebratory joy, as well as on the song's visual emphasis on land, especially at the beginning, because I find it very powerful.
Yeah, great question. So as a writer myself, and I always appreciate when there's Indigenous expressive culture that's not so focused and reactionary to colonization. Like, there's also a long history of the stoicism of Native peoples. Me and all my cousins, family, friends, I'll talk about this all the time, about stoicism. And so to see people, you know, multi-generations of women, young people smiling, having a good time, celebrating, to me is just as significant as someone creating visual aesthetics that are challenging or just like stoic, silent. And to me, and I think any oppressed peoples, regardless of situation, understand that you do laugh. It's a simple thing to say, but people do smile and laugh regardless of their condition, right? And the most Indigenous thing one can do is laugh and smile regardless of what's happening, even in tough situations. And land, there's a whole land back movement that's happening in the US and Canada. And land and featuring land is a key part of that. If I had any, and this is just a gentle, it's not even a critique, it's just an observation. I wish there was more emphasis on land and cities in particular, given that the majority of Indigenous peoples of both Canada and the US, in fact, live in cities. In the US, it's 80%. I think in Canada, roughly 65 to 70%. And many of those, you know, land or urban is kind of the antithesis of modernity for Native peoples, that is. So to include the visuals of the urban, I think would also be a powerful thing. And I wish more would be able to do such things.
Thank you so much. I believe Gustavo had raised his hand. I'm not really sure if there's a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Mays, Dr. Mays. I don't know how to correct term, but this was an amazing presentation. I appreciate you sharing the music and letting it just play and letting us take it all in. I wanted to ask about, you're from the Detroit area, is that correct? Did I understand that right?
Yeah.
So wondering how, I'm looking at the Frantz Fanon quote about combat literature, and I'm curious if you have connections or if you could speak on some Detroit techno groups like Underground Resistance and how that might play into what you're working on and studying.
I mean, techno kind of in a general sense, yes. Not in particular into what I write about or research, but kind of the sound. Jay Dilla was always important to me. And the music of folks like Sacramento Knox, who has continued to do amazing both Indigenous hip hop, organizing in the city as well. But for me, it's mostly on the hip hop side, right? That musical history is an influence, but not directly to what I have been doing and what I'm doing now.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, I do have another question, but it may be a very simple one, actually. Just following up of the first question that was asked, I was thinking, especially if the two first songs that we were listening to, which have very different aesthetics, right? One seems to be reclaiming and celebrating diversity across generations and addressing deep-seated discrimination and violence, at least partially, and the other one, I really like this direct critique that it has, right, by burning the flag and with lines such as civilization brought the illness. And I was wondering, how has this music been received in the context of missing and murdered Indigenous women?
I think in general, it's been received pretty well. There's another video. Her name is Pookie G and Bree Skull, and they have a kind of a more direct approach to an issue around missing, murdered Indigenous women. For example, they begin their video with different examples and statistics of things that happen to Indigenous women, young girls, children, and so forth. So that one's a bit more direct in that sense. But I would say in general, well received and appreciated by various communities and bringing light to this particular issue.
Thank you. We do have a question by Anna.
Yes, I was thinking, I don't know, because it's not something I work on, but it reminded me like I work on Chicanic stuff, but not specifically on hip hop. But for some reason, the videos that you were showing us reminded me of Chicanx rap and Chicanx hip hop. And especially this, I don't know, both thematically, as in sort of talking about a community that is a bit broader than just your pulse, in a way, just a community that is your community as a social network that you have. And as well, there was some references to Indigenous heritage as well, which is interesting because sometimes Mexican American rappers also use images and references to Mexican heritage, and also this talking about colonial topics, which is something that Mexican Americans and Chicanx rappers also try to do. So I was just wondering, what do you think about it in general, and about the heritage? Are there many Indigenous Native artists that actually put a lot of their own Indigenous heritage in their videos and in their songs? I thought it was interesting that the one video that had a little bit more of that also played with Back to the Future, which is a fairly mainstream white movie. So I thought it was interesting that the video that had also the visual references to heritage was also the one that used that reference, popular culture reference.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the artists will utilize and include their Indigenous heritage in some capacity. So whether the speaking of language, whether the use of Native artists who are making fashion and clothing, like in the last video, the particular jacket he has on is from a company called The Natives, who produces this sort of fashion and aesthetic. And I think the one difference between, we'll say, Chicanx hip hop and I'll say Indigenous hip hop is the Chicanx one is a bit more complicated in the sense that what is the actual Indigenous heritage? So I named like particular heritage of most of the people that I mentioned. And when I have, I'm always reminded that Mexico, for example, is a settler colony, right? So not everyone from Mexico, even if they're claiming Indigenous heritage, which happens in the US too, are actually Indigenous, or that is connected in some capacity to an Indigenous nation, heritage, and so forth. Because one of my good friends and colleagues, Jessica Hernandez, who has a cool book called Fresh Banana Leaves, is Indigenous from Oaxaca in El Salvador, right? And so one of the critiques she levies is those claiming an Indigenous heritage without being connected to a particular community in Mexico, and not like things like Aztlan and those sort of other things. They have, you know, a place, but there are still thriving Indigenous communities, both in, we'll say, the southern, southwestern part of the US and in Mexico as well. So these folks have a particular Indigenous heritage that they're connected to. And then, you know, it depends on those who are Chicanx, what they're actually claiming. And do Indigenous peoples also claim that, like, what living community are they claiming is, to me, always a kind of question. And what's their interaction with those living Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Because for Mexican Americans and Chicanx people in particular, of course, this Aztlán is a very imaginary and mythical construct rather than actually a place or a community or something that is well defined. So, and of course, that is the intrinsic part of the intrinsic wound the Mexican Americans are expressing. And what I was thinking, what you were saying about, you were saying this about to what specific group you refer to when you produce your music. I don't know if there are hip hop artists, but it reminds me of how Oaxaca, California works. That is the community that is Oaxacan indigenous people that still do a lot of their own heritage, their own specific Oaxacan heritage in the US. And I don't know, maybe they even have rap, I don't know. So it might be,
so
it might be a good...
Is Mare Argentina. Mare, I remember I spoke with her in Oaxaca years ago, and you know, she raps in Zapotec, has a lot of cool things connected to. We were at a bookstore and she was telling me how much Angela Davis and Black feminism has influenced her sort of political ideology as well. So, yeah, I mean, there are, and even in local places, there are indigenous rappers in, say, Oaxaca de Juarez who are doing that sort of cool work too. They're not as mainstream as, say, Mare is, for example, but there are many folks doing that, whether they're Mayan rappers, all sorts of folks.
Yeah, Mayan rappers, there's many.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you.
We have another question by Carla, who's telling me that she can ask her question without the camera, or I can read it myself. So whatever you prefer, Carla, just let us know.
Thank you, Paula. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm going to read what I wrote. Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to ask a question that maybe it's a bit basic or commonsensical, but the rhymed song remind me of Yaren Mona's hip-hop song Django Jane, which she wrote as an anthem for herself and for other Black women facing lack of recognition within her field. So I was wondering if for Indigenous female hip-hop artists, there's something similar going on regarding challenges to recognize their art within Indigenous hip-hop music.
Yeah, well, first of all, Janelle Monáe has been my summer anthem. Her new album has been amazing this year. So shout out to Janelle Monáe. And Float is really dope, and all the aesthetics and videos to that. Anyways, yes, to answer that directly, they still deal with the same sort of sexism, patriarchal things, and trying to get their music out. Some are like, you're too manly or masculine than others. It's literally the same issues that Black women in hip hop face right now, or have faced and continue to face within the hip hop music industry. But yeah, there's not a lot to say that besides patriarchy has also infiltrated Indigenous communities and Indigenous hip hop as well.
Thank you.
Well, are there any other questions? If we don't have any other questions, then please join me in thanking Professor Mays for joining us today. We appreciate it greatly. Thank you so much.
You all appreciate it.